Reading this morning is from Romans chapter 8. And if you want to follow along in your pew Bibles, it will be on page 1757. Page 1757. But it's Romans chapter 8, beginning with verse 14. Romans chapter 8, verses 14 through 25, and we'll skip down to 31 and 32. So beginning with Romans 8, verse 14. Because those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship. And by him we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Now if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what he already has? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. Now let's get down to verse 31. What then shall we say in response to this? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Right. Isn't it great to be a child of God?
Yes.
And we are. We are children of God. As it says in verse 14, for as many are led by the Spirit of God, these are sons and daughters of God. We are children of our heavenly Father, adopted in his infinite love and mercy, heirs to the kingdom of heaven, as it says in verse 17. Now, last week at Pleasant Hill, the church where I attend regularly, I teach Sunday school class there, but our pastor is out of town for annual conference. So I filled in for him last week. And in my message, I addressed the nature of sin, starting with the Garden of Eden. And if you guys happen to want to look that up, the video is on YouTube. It's called The God of Second, Third, and Fourth Chances. But here, in this passage we read, it illustrates the ultimate resolution of this sinful world that I talked about last week, filled with pain, suffering, death, disease, sorrow, and heartache. These are all the things that we face in this world today. And here we just read about how all of creation is in birth pangs, as it says in verse 22, awaiting the delivery of the child of promise, the deliverance of this world from corruption into, quote, the glorious liberty of the children of God. And that's verse 21. So here we see about the resolution of that, to where right now we're living in this world of sin, sorrow, decay, pain, and suffering. And there's coming a day when we're going to see that resolved, when we're not going to have to deal with all that anymore. And today, I want to talk about our Father's love. And I picked this message mostly because it's Father's Day, but also because of this past week as I attended Leah Clark's funeral service. some of the things that I witnessed and saw there just really spoke to me, and I felt like I had to address it also. But God, our Father, loves us. He cares for our well-being, and He wants what's best for us. Now, how many here are parents? Okay. How much, this is a rhetorical question, but how much do you love your child? What wouldn't you do for your child? If we look in the scriptures, we go back to the book of 1 Samuel. We read the story about how Samuel was born. And his mother, Hannah, some of us know her story, but Hannah and her husband, Elkanah, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not, but it's spelled Elkanah. They both worshiped God, it says in 1 Samuel 1, verse 3. But Hannah had no children, and the belief was that she couldn't have children. And we see that a lot today, where families just can't seem to have children as much as they try, and they go through all different sorts of things trying to have a child. And she was so distraught, it says in verse 7, that she wept and did not eat. And in verse 10 it says she wept in anguish and was in bitterness of soul. Now I have some really close friends, one of my best friends, and his wife, when they first got married, they tried for a long time to have children, and just they couldn't seem to have any children. And just like Hannah, especially on the wife, it really got her upset, and she was bitter, she was angry, she was sorrowful, she was depressed, and she just had that maternal need to have a child. And in verse 8, 1 Samuel 1, verse 8, Elkanah, her husband, sees her in this distress, and he says to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? And now, ladies, honestly, would this line work with you? If you were in that situation and your husband says to you, aren't I good enough? No, that was a mistake of him. Now, this is a well-intentioned husband. He was trying to do the right thing and trying to comfort her, and in reality, he probably just made it worse. Men, I think one of the differences between men and women in general, and this is just a generalization, it's not, with everybody, but in general, men don't like their loved ones to be in pain and suffering, and they naturally want to fix whatever problems there are. And so Elkanah comes along and he says, here, let me help you fix this problem. And it's not helping. He's like, just don't be so sad. At least you've got me, right? And of course that didn't help. It didn't solve her problem, first of all. But then this is the other difference between men and women, is that in general, again, women, when they're in a situation like that, they typically want sympathy and understanding, not necessarily for their problems to be fixed. Sometimes they know that the problem can't be fixed. And correct me if I'm wrong, ladies, but they just want a shoulder to cry on, an ear to listen. They want somebody that's sympathetic and understands what they're going through. And as much as he loved her, Elkanah couldn't fix the problem. And as a man myself, I try to put myself in his shoes, and I imagine that he felt powerless and a failure as a husband. The woman he loved was in pain, and he couldn't do anything to fix it. So Hannah finally turned to the one who could help her. In verse 10 it says, she prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. Now, in our society today, we look at that specification of wanting a male child, and it's not the same today. Of course, we always have that, when the baby's born or when they find out the gender, it's a boy, and then the husband, the father, always gets excited. It's like, yes, a son. But it was a little bit more than that back in those days for their culture and their time. Number one, they wanted a male child to carry on the family name. And, we're kind of the same way today. We want our family name to continue. And so it's always good that you have a male child to carry on your family name. And secondly, it helps to have boys around to help on the farm, so to speak. To help around the house and with the duties. And in their culture, that was a huge thing. If you had male children, they could help you with the crops and with building, whatever needed repairs or whatever. And also, she had that maternal instinct, as I said, needing a child to love. And there's a love that you have for a husband or a wife. Then there's a love that you have for a child, and they're similar, but they're not the same. And she was missing that piece in her life, that she felt that desire and that need to have a child of her own that she could give that love to. It's also, looking from my own perspective, I can see how it's comforting that after you're gone, a part of you still lives. And we see ourselves in our children. When a child is born, we say, oh, he's got his nose or her eyes or whatever. And you see yourself in your children. And then as they grow up, you start to see yourself in their behaviors and their mannerisms and their actions, sometimes in their interests. And it's always a joy for a parent to see their child growing up and following somewhat in their footsteps, even if it may not be in all their interests and things they like to do. But they like to see themselves in their children. I think that's natural. Now, I see some of my dad's physical traits and some of my mom's physical traits in me as well. People have told me for years that I look like my dad. And I couldn't see it for many, many years. And then one day I was looking at some pictures of myself, and then I saw some pictures of him when he was my age, and I was like, you know what? I see it now. The jawline and everything. I can see that now, the physical resemblance to my father. But I favor my mother more in the sense of talents and interests and things like that. She's more artistic and musical type, whereas Dad's more the farm type. Now, my two brothers, Darren and Jeremy, they favor Dad as far as interest. They're both farmers. They like to go out and get their hands dirty. I'm more of a stay inside and get on the computer or play the piano or the guitar or something like that. So that's the differences that I see between them. Now, don't tell my dad I'm telling you this because it'll probably embarrass him. But my dad, he's got a tough exterior, but he's really soft on the inside. He's the kind of person that likes to hide behind that tough exterior. And as a farmer, and you're living in farm country, I'm sure you've all probably experienced this. Maybe you're that way yourself. And I am also to a certain extent, a little bit, but not nearly to the degree that my dad is. But tough on the outside, but on the inside, he's got a heart of gold. He would do anything in the world for you that he could. Just recently, not too long ago, I was driving my car in Marietta down Putnam Street, and the brakes went out on my car. And afterwards, I thought, thank God that I was on Putnam Street in the middle of town. It was just starting to get dark, and I wasn't out on one of these hillsides, going down a hill, and it went out. And so I just kind of coasted off the side of the road, parked the car, got out, tried to check the fluids and look it over, but it was too dark. I couldn't see. I didn't have a flashlight with me. My mistake. That's one thing Dad yelled at me about when I called. It's like, why don't you have a flashlight? And so that's the tough exterior on Dad, saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? I told you to take better care of your car, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? I didn't expect, I was just going to leave the car sitting there on the side of the road. I just called him to see if he can give me a ride. And then I'd worry later about having the car taken care of and go getting it fixed. Well, he drove his truck all the way into town, and he wouldn't leave the car there. He checked the fluids and everything, and it had a leak. There was a leak that it just started quickly and drained, and so he knew we had to replace that. And so he topped off the fluid, and I was going to drive it. He wanted to get the car off the road so it wouldn't get towed or it wouldn't get damaged or broken into or whatever. And so I was going to drive the car out, and he was telling me how you have to ride the emergency brake and everything. And he wouldn't let me drive the car. He drove the car himself and rode the brake all the way out home through the countryside, down the hills and everything. And I followed in his truck. Now that's the love that my dad had for me. That, the love of a father, that he wouldn't let me drive the car and risk myself. And I feel terrible about it that he did that, but there was no talking him out of it. And so he did that for me, and the next day, he got up early, we went out, he drove me downtown to get the parts I needed, we went back and fixed the car together. And all honestly, he did most of the fixing because I know next to nothing about cars. But that's what a father's like. We see sometimes the tough exterior, but on the inside they've got a heart of gold, and they'll give you the shirt off your back if that's what it takes to keep you happy and content and at peace and to have your needs met. So from the perspective of knowing firsthand the love of a parent for a child, Hannah promised her child to God, and we do the same when we dedicate them, when we dedicate our children. Now, when my daughter was born, shortly after, we had a dedication service where some people call it baptism. We call it dedication because we considered that, when she gets older, she could decide on her own whether she wanted to be baptized. Because in my view, of my understanding of Scripture, baptism is a choice that you make for yourself to follow God. And when you get baptized, that's your way of confessing and letting the world around you know that you've made that decision. So we can't make that decision for anybody except for ourselves. We couldn't make that decision for her. But we could make the decision that we were going to raise her the best way we could. We were going to teach her right from wrong and train her up, as the Bible says, train her up in a way she should go. And when she's old, she shall not depart from it. And that's what a dedication is where you're committing to trying to raise that child to the best of your ability, to become the best person that they possibly can be, to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And so that's what we did. We gave her to God. And Hannah did it in a larger sense, though. For her, by giving her son back to God, it literally meant that she wouldn't be with him anymore. She sent him with the priest, Eli, to live and to serve God. And she couldn't go with him to the temple or to the tabernacle. She couldn't live with him. So she waited until he was old enough to be weaned, and then she took him and presented him to Eli. And that would be devastating, I think, for most mothers. But she kept her promise to God. And the promise was basically, she told God, I thought I had that in my notes here, but I must have skipped it. But there's a passage in 1 Samuel where she said to God, she said, I did read it. If you will look upon your maidservant and not forget her, give me a child, then I will give this child back to you. She made that promise. And she kept it. Now, we ask ourselves, how could she do this? Well, first of all, she knew he was in good hands. Now, this brings me to Leah's funeral this week. When I walked in the door, first walked in, I expected there to be all sorts of tears and crying and just sadness and, red faces and all that. And I walked up through, and her brother recognized me, jumped up and waved to me. And when I got close enough, he ran up and hugged me. And Marvin shook my hand. He didn't look like he'd been crying. And Dina looked like she was being very strong. And then Marvin got up and he spoke. And it floored me. And it shouldn't have, because knowing Marvin, he's a very strong man in his faith. And he told about, her faith walk and how he knew that she was safe. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, it may not seem to many of you that I don't seem sad enough, but I know where my daughter is. She's home in her father's arms. And that really meant a lot to me, because when you think about the love that a parent has for their child, and to know that he had just lost his firstborn daughter, 29 years old, and he had the strength to say, I understand. You know, I'm her daddy, but she's got another father. She's got another daddy, and she's home with him right now. I just had him on loan, or I just had her on loan from God, and now I have to give her back. And that's got to be one of the hardest things for a parent to have to do. And he was strong enough that he did it, and he stood up with a dry face, and he testified to that. And it was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. We have to realize that this is not our home. We're not just passing through. And our children, in the larger sense, are not our own. We're only on loan to our parents until we finally return home to our Heavenly Father. And compared to God, we're like foster parents in a sense, or babysitters or daycare workers. And this isn't to diminish the role or the love that a parent has for the children, but only to illustrate that God's is so much greater. Hannah knew that her son would have a great future. Samuel, her son, became a great prophet, and he was the one who anointed and ministered King Saul, and then later King David. He is one of the greatest prophets of all time. He ministered to the priest Eli and inherited his priesthood and judgeship over Israel when God removed Eli's wicked sons. And it said he judged over Israel for the rest of his life. So Hannah knew that she was putting him in safe hands. What wouldn't we do to sacrifice for our children? There's a Denzel Washington movie. I was going to look it up, but I forgot to try to look that up. But there's a Denzel Washington movie, I think it is, where his child is, and if anybody recognizes the title, you can go ahead and shout it out. But there's a Denzel Washington movie, I think, where his child is like needing medical attention. And John Q. That's it. Thank you very much. The movie John Q. And so he ends up going to a hospital and taking them hostage until they treat his child. Now, how many of us would go to that extreme? Would we go take hostages with at gunpoint to save our child? We think of the illegal immigrants bringing or sending their children across the border. You know, they're breaking the law. Would you do that for your child? And I don't want to get political. You know, I try to avoid political subjects. I'm just, trying to put myself in their shoes and see it from their perspective, because honestly, I can see both sides of the argument. So I'm not going to tell you, politically what side to be on. But people rob banks, they burglarize homes, and they perpetrate scams such as identity theft in order to provide for their families. So I sympathize, but at the same time, I can't justify or excuse it. Have you or someone you know received one of those scam phone calls where they claim to be from the IRS? My mother's been getting those like crazy. And sometimes the phone will ring, and on the caller ID it comes up a local number, but you answer it, and it's either a computerized voice, or it's somebody with a thick Indian accent, trying to sell you something, or just many different things. But you get one of these phone calls, and they, the ones that claim to be from the IRS, they'll try to get you to buy a prepaid gift card and send that in to them to pay for your supposed IRS debt. Well, and then there was the Nigerian prince scam, which one of the first ones, and I actually dealt with it back when I was living in Marietta. A guy that was one of these Nigerian one of these Nigerian princes tried to scam me, and I saw through it. And so I played along with him, but it's a long story. But anyway, the scammers are robbing and cheating you and trying to steal your personal and financial information. And a lot of them are doing it to provide for their families. On the news recently, they caught up with a scammer, and they cornered him, and they were asking him, why are you doing this? And he's like, well, I have a family I have to provide for. This is my job. They said, your job is cheating people? And he's like, well, yeah. And he was upfront about it. Yeah, I'm going to cheat you to help my family. And so this is where a lot of them are getting, the illegal immigrants are getting their fake Social Security numbers and stuff. And so they're really scamming you. And I can't blame them entirely because the employers are hiring them too. And, they're letting them get away with it. And they're taking advantage of them too. The employers are. So one day you try to get a loan, or the real IRS comes knock on your door because somebody's been earning money using your Social Security number, and now you have to pay back taxes on their earnings. So we can't justify taking advantage of one person in order to help another. So we have to find legitimate, honest ways to help those who need it. The mercy we give to the guilty cannot be at the expense of the innocent. And this is what I talked about last week, is the balance that God gives us between justice and mercy. And he's a God of second and third and fourth chances. And he'll give us, I talked about Nineveh, to where he gave them a second chance. And Jonah had a fit. He's like, you can't forgive all these people. I already said you're going to rain judgment on them. You're going to make me look like a false prophet. And God said, they repented. They changed their minds. They turned around. They deserved mercy. And he gave them mercy. And he gave countless chances to Pharaoh to let the Egyptians go. But Pharaoh, every time he extended mercy, Pharaoh hardened his heart and went back on his word and said, no, I changed my mind. I'm not going to let him go. So you have to balance the mercy with justice. And we cannot give mercy to the guilty at the expense of the innocent. Otherwise, we're perpetrating another injustice. Charity is giving what is yours to give. When you take somebody else's stuff and give it away, that's theft. Now, Jesus endorsed the former, but he didn't endorse the latter. And I think it's important for our society today that we understand carefully that difference between charity and giving away what doesn't belong to us to give it in the first place. So God blessed Hannah for her faithfulness. God gave her the child that she prayed for, and then she kept her word and gave him back to God. We see the same thing with Abraham and Isaac. Abraham loved Isaac so much. He and Sarah had prayed for years to have a son and couldn't have a son. And then they did all sorts of stuff to try to have a son on their own. And then God finally gave him Isaac and then said one day, take him up and sacrifice him. Can you imagine that? But he obeyed. He took him up on the hillside and he was going to sacrifice him, and God stopped him. He said, you don't have to follow through with this. But he was ready to give his son back to God. We saw the same thing here with Hannah and Samuel. And we saw the same thing with Marvin and Leah. As much as they loved their children, they were faithful and willing to sacrifice being with their child, knowing that they would be safe in God's care. And I don't think there's a greater love that a parent can have than to surrender their child to God's will. Hannah went on to have 3 more sons and 2 daughters. So God was blessing her for her faithfulness. My friend that I mentioned earlier, who so desperately wanted a child, went on to have 3 children of their own. And after the first one, they weren't even trying for the second and third one. They just came. And so God rewards the faithful and the patient in his timing. So if you're feeling neglected or forgotten by God, stay faithful and trust him. He loves us and wants the best for us, just as we do for our children. Matthew 6, verses 9 through 11 says, what man is there among you who, if his son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will he give him a serpent? If you then, being evil, know then how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? So again, how much do you love your child? Do you love them enough to trust them to God's will? Hannah, Abraham, and even Marvin loved their children and trusted God enough that they were willing to let them go. When we trust our children into God's care, dedicate them to his service, and lead them in his path, we know we're placing them in good hands. And when it comes time for them to leave us in what our instinct tells us should be the worst day of our lives, we know that they're only going home to the shelter of their Father's arms. Let's pray.